Hi everyone, Dr. Robin Chutkan here, gastroenterologist from Digestive Center for Wellness and Gut Bliss, coming to you live with my usual office hours. We've moved from Tuesdays at noon to Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it gives me a little more time because Wednesday's a non-clinical day for me. So I'm so glad you're joining me today for office hours, and today we're talking about one of my favorite topics, a topic that is really misunderstood, and that's leaky gut, otherwise known as an increase in intestinal permeability. So let's give folks just a couple more seconds to join, and then we'll get right into it. The most important thing in this discussion is for you to really understand what we're talking about when we talk about intestinal permeability. And I'll just say there's a lot of commerce out there masquerading as research and medicine. So it's important to know when you are being marketed to somebody trying to sell you a product versus when you're really getting scientific information. And one of the things that I really pride myself on is I am only ever selling you good, clinically validated scientific information through primarily my books. If you're interested in leaky gut, my first book, Gut Bliss, is a great place to start. I also go into it a little bit in my second book, The Microbiome Solution, and book number 4, The Antiviral Gut, does talk a little bit about the link between intestinal permeability and long COVID. So Gut Bliss is a great place to sort of get an intro, and then you can get a little bit deeper in Microbiome Solution and all the way in with Antiviral Gut. But enough of that. Let's talk about what we are actually referring to when we talk about leaky gut. And to define that, we've got to start with what is the intestinal gut lining. Let me move my table up here a little bit more. So the gut lining has 3 important layers to it. So remember, we're talking about the inside of the gut, this hollow tunnel that runs from the mouth to the anus. And of course, you have all the trillions of microbes in the gut lumen. So the gut lumen is the inside of the gut. Right up against the gut lining, you have the mucus layer. And the mucus layer is actually quite a thick layer. And to put it in perspective, this is a statistic from the Antiviral Gut. It is about 5,000 times the diameter of a poliovirus, which is similar to SARS-CoV-2 virus. And my football analogy, trust me when I tell you, this is the only thing I know about football, is that Tom Brady would have to wade through 150 gel-filled football fields to score a touchdown in the end zone. That's how far SARS-CoV-2 and poliovirus have to wade through that mucus layer to get to the gut lining. And I don't know what the end zone is. I don't know what a touchdown is, but my husband did the math for me and said that that is the equivalent. So the point here is that the mucus layer provides a very thick layer barrier to protect the gut lining. And so in the outer part of the mucus that's sort of in contact with the gut lumen, you have a lot of bacteria floating around, but as you get closer in to the actual epithelial lining, there are not a lot of bacteria there. And part of the purpose of the mucus layer, in addition to providing a barrier, is also to really prevent the bacteria from adhering to the lining, from sticking to the lining. Okay, so it's like a repellent as well as a barrier. So part number 1 of the gut lining is the mucus layer. Part number 2 is the actual gut epithelial lining itself. And that is mostly composed of intestinal cells called enterocytes. Enterocytes in the small intestine, small intestine, colonocytes in the colon, well, you know what that is. And then there's some other cells in there. They're Paneth cells or goblet cells that secrete the mucus, but it's generally then you have the intestinal cells. So again, you have the mucus layer on the outside, the intestinal cells, and then right on the inside of the intestinal cells, you have the immune defense barrier where you have the intraepithelial lymphocytes, the T lymphocytes, etc. Okay, so just to summarize, not to hit you over the head with this, but I realize, maybe a few years since you studied your gut immunology and physiology. I know it has been since I studied mine. Mucus layer, thick, think 150 gel-filled football fields to get to the end zone. Gut epithelial lining, just one cell thick of cells going across, and then the immune barrier, the sort of immune mechanisms going on the inside of that, okay? So that is your gut lining. Now, what I want to tell you as a gastroenterologist who is not trying to sell you, nonsense supplements or any other potions or cures, but only trying to provide you with good, again, clinical, scientifically backed information, is that, get ready, drum roll, there is zero evidence that any supplement out there heals the gut lining. Okay, so all your questions you have about what about this, what about zinc and glutamine and blah, 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 what about short chain fatty acids? Zero evidence that zinc or glutamine or short chain fatty acids or any other prebiotic pill, any supplement that you are being sold, we don't have any direct evidence that any of those products heal the gut lining. Okay. What we do have is lots of evidence about what harms the gut lining. And I want to talk about some big categories. The first are things that stress the body. So believe it or not, endurance exercise. Now I'm a huge fan of endurance exercise. I'm a slow but steady marathoner. I've done about 5 or 6 marathons, and about a dozen half marathons. As I said, I am not breaking any records. Eliud Kipchoge does not need to worry about me coming up on his flank because I am slow. I've never run a marathon faster than 4 hours, but I do really enjoy endurance exercise. I'm also aware that from a physiological point of view, in terms of what's going on with your gut, endurance exercise stresses the body. It doesn't mean it's not good for you, but there are lots of studies showing that in people who are doing endurance exercise, they can show an increase in intestinal permeability. Now that is probably a physiologic adaptation, not a damage mediating response. It probably has something to do with the increased needs, metabolic needs when you're running or biking or whatever, long distances. And so the permeability increases, and that is a temporary increase in permeability. So we can show that after periods of endurance exercise, that intestinal permeability comes back down to normal. Pregnancy, that's another stressed state. Even though you may be, perfectly, happy and content and not feeling stressed at all, pregnancy does stress your body in terms of some of the hormonal changes. So we also see an increase in intestinal permeability in pregnant women. Again, not a disease state, likely a physiological mechanism that is happening for some very good reasons. Maybe to increase the amount of fluid, to maintain amniotic fluid levels. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows, but we see that pregnancy is one of those stress states. Then there's just plain old stress. Now, chronic stress seems to not have an adaptive advantage to it. So being in a chronic sort of fight or flight state where cortisol and epinephrine and other things are increased and your body is in this heightened state of alert seems to be not a good state for your body to be in. And that is associated with an increase in intestinal permeability and obviously associated with some other damaging things in your body. Okay, so those are some of the stressed states: endurance exercise, pregnancy, and chronic stress. I'm not talking about acute stress, like a snake appears in the bookshelf behind me, which would be, I would go bonkers. I would be very stressed. Not that kind of acute stress, because that kind of acute stress is designed to confer a survival advantage. Namely, all these hormones get revved up and I'm supposed to bolt out of the room and, not get bitten by the snake. But the chronic stress that like, my kid's applying to college, is she going to get in? Oh, what about work, the mortgage? That sort of chronic grinding. You wake up in the morning worried, you go to bed at night worried, you're worried, low grade throughout the day. That kind of chronic stress. Mostly about things that happened in the past or may happen in the future. So that chronic stress really doesn't serve a purpose. It's not like getting you away from danger, but that is a chronic stress that seems to drive up intestinal permeability. Okay, what else? Hugest category that I see in my gastroenterology practice is drug-induced increases. And just think about it. We're using drugs to try and heal damage from other drugs. Wouldn't it make more sense to just stop the drugs that are doing the damage? Yes, that makes sense, right? It's like probiotics. Like a probiotic is doing very little, if anything at all, for most people. So a better way to approach it is to be more judicious about the antibiotic that you're about to take that you probably don't really need, right? That is going to prevent the damage, and trying to mitigate the damage after is very difficult, if not impossible for most people. So non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, known as NSAIDs, are the most damaging medications for the gut lining, short of things like radiation and high-dose chemo and stuff, but sort of things that most people would encounter. they literally make holes in your gut lining. When those holes are big, they're called an ulcer. And I see those all the time with my endoscope in the stomach, in the duodenum, and further down in the small intestine. Either little erosions or big ulcers. They can actually cause perforations in the gut lining where there's a hole so big that the gut lining now is significantly compromised. And that's obviously a life-threatening situation. So non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, biggest cause of increase in intestinal permeability as far as the medicine cabinet goes. And you know that I'm a big believer that the medicine cabinet is often the cause of the problem, not the solution. Of course, you know, there are drugs that can be very helpful, but NSAIDs basically keep us in business as gastroenterologists between ulcers and erosions and more significant damage. They can also flare up many chronic GI disorders that they don't cause, but they flare up. Microscopic colitis, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, diverticulosis. These are all things that are worsened by non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And it's a longer list than just that. So if you are concerned about leaky gut and intestinal permeability, the number one thing you need to do is not take NSAIDs. Now, I know that the ibuprofen in NSAIDs, so we're talking about Advil, Aleve, Anacin, Naproxen, all these different drugs. And keep in mind that many cough medicines and cough and cold over-the-counter medicines also have NSAIDs in them. So you need to read the label and look for any form of ibuprofen. Keep in mind these drugs are really powerful and they're really good at what they do, which is to alleviate pain and inflammation. I've had a number of various athletic-related injuries. I tore my medium collateral ligament, my MCL snowboarding several years ago. And that Advil, man, that took away the pain. I had a snowboarding concussion, if you're sensing a theme here, last year, cracked a tooth, ended up with emergency extraction, was in a lot of pain. Again, high-dose ibuprofen made a humongous difference for me, just essentially zapped the pain. So I understand both as a physician and as a consumer how convenient and how powerful and effective these drugs can be. But what I'm trying to tell you is there is a significant price to be paid. So again, my number one piece of advice to you is always judicious use of these drugs. And you know, if you're taking ibuprofen, Advil, something like that on a regular basis, say for period pain with your menstrual cycle, think about taking less, lower dose, think about combining it with a little Tylenol, assuming your liver is okay. Think about ice pack, heat, other things. I give lots of examples in book number 4, The Antiviral Gut. I have a whole section for medications there where I talk about, with NSAIDs, alternatives, safer types of NSAIDs, lower dose, etc., questions to ask your doctor. So always searching for how we can do less damage even when a medication is still necessary. But I want you to know that just the reality, no matter how much zinc or glutamine or prebiotics you take, if you are taking NSAIDs on a regular basis, you're damaging your gut, okay? So that's another big category. Huge category are emulsifiers in foods. What am I talking about when I say emulsifiers? So you've probably read, there's been a lot of press recently about ultra-processed foods, what they are. And so potato chips are ultra-processed foods. Well, they may be processed, not ultra-processed, because there's an actual definition of ultra-processed foods use food-like ingredients, but not actual food. And so depending on what brand of potato chips you're buying, if it's just, potatoes and canola oil and salt, it's not an ultra-processed food, it's processed. But depending on whether there are other things in there. But emulsifiers are the same thing that are in paint that really prevent paint from separating. So you get a can of paint, you got to mix it up a little bit, but if you didn't have an emulsifier in the paint, it would really separate into the different layers. It's like what happens with my green smoothie in the morning if I don't drink it quickly enough. As you can see, the thicker layer with more of the fiber, and then, as you go down, it turns almost clear, right? So there's no emulsifier in that, and so I have to shake it up to mix it up. So emulsifiers are not food. Things like soy lecithin and carrageenan and some of these other things, they are chemical substances that may, a long time ago, many processes back in the food manufacturing process, they may have been derived from a food ingredient, but be very clear, they are not food. They are chemicals. And they are not in there to feed you or your microbes. They're there to do something to this ultra-processed food so that it is more palatable, either to make the consistency smooth, a flavor, something like that. When we're talking about emulsifiers, it's primarily for mixing it. So I give you an example. Most plant-based milks, you've heard me say dairy is for baby cows, so plant-based milks can be a good option. But unfortunately, many of them have these emulsifiers in them. And if you've ever made almond milk at home, you know that it separates very quickly. But you buy the almond milk or the oat milk at the store, and you have to shake it a little bit, but even without shaking, it's pretty smooth, sort of one consistency. And that is because they contain emulsifiers, the vast majority of them. So, if you're having this stuff every once in a while, if you're eating ultra-processed food once a month or something, less than 10% of your diet, probably not that big a deal, but many of us are eating or drinking ultra-processed foods every single day. Even things like granola bars. I have my granola bar in my drawer there that I've had in there for about 4 years that I pull out, and let me just pull it out, hold on. Okay. Here's an example. You think, okay, Nature Valley, sweet and salty, not peanut, chewy granola. And so this seems fantastic, right? Somebody just asked, how about organic soy? Yes, most soy milks are ultra processed. They have a lot of ingredients in them. So let me just read you some ingredients off of this. So it starts out pretty good. Roasted peanuts, corn, syrup, not so good. Whole grain oats, sugar, rice, flour. So those are all sounding like food. But then you get into palm kernel oil, vegetable glycerin, fructose, canola oil, soy lecithin. There's some honey roasted almond butter, maltodextrin, not a food. Mixed tocopherols, not food. Baking soda, not food. Natural flavor, not food. So again, contains bioengineered food ingredients. Bioengineered food ingredients are not food. And so the ultra-processed foods are with emulsifiers and other chemicals are a huge reason why we're seeing so many gut problems. And again, the solution is not to take some zinc and glutamine that is doing absolutely nothing for your gut. The solution is to stop eating these ultra-processed foods. There's been a lot of data, some of it from Brazil and other countries where they're doing a lot of research on this. And they found that, in America, most Americans, ultra-processed foods are 52% of their diet. And not only are they associated with gut issues, but they're associated with dementia, with early aging, and with dying younger. But from my perspective as a gastroenterologist, not that I'm not concerned about your aging or dying younger, but honing in on the gut issues, we are seeing a tremendous amount of disruption of the gut as a result of all these chemicals in our food. Now, there's some groups of people who have to be really careful about this, and these are people with inflammatory conditions of the gut. So I'm not talking about somebody who thinks their gut is inflamed, but if you have a diagnosis of celiac disease, which we know is an autoimmune disease, and it's an allergy to gluten, the protein in wheat, rye, and barley. If you have Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, so those are two forms of inflammatory bowel disease, not irritable bowel, IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, autoimmune disease. If you have ulcers from taking NSAIDs, we also have some studies showing that increased permeability can be associated with irritable bowel syndrome, particularly people who have pain, but we can't really draw a straight line to those conditions. So all of us need to be aware of emulsifiers in food and how that can increase our intestinal permeability and compromise our gut, because our gut lining is there to protect us, right? It's there to keep stuff that's outside the gut, which is in the gut lumen, but it's there to keep it outside the body, in the gut lumen where, it can end up in the toilet bowl where it essentially belongs and not being absorbed through and getting into your bloodstream, etc. So these are some of the things to be aware about. Alcohol is another big one. Anything that disrupts that mucus layer. So for example, antihistamines that dry you up and dry up that mucus, make you feel comfortable. Oh, my nose isn't dripping, but you're also decreasing production of mucus from the gut because your GI tract is where most of that mucus is made, about 1.5 liters per day. So things like antihistamines and any of those sort of expectorants, and there's cough and cold medicines that dry up mucus. And so things like ephedrine, pseudoephedrine, etc. They make you feel better, but it comes at a cost, okay? The other thing are bile acids from foods, and that's sort of a whole long, complicated topic. We're not gonna get into that too much, but those are, again, digestive surfactants that can increase the gut permeability. But there's a long list in Gut Bliss and in the Microbiome Solution and in Antiviral Gut. I have the long list of all the different things, different infections, artificial sweeteners, etc. So lots of things can disrupt the gut lining. But here is where we get into the myth busting now. the idea that we can draw a straight line between an increase in intestinal permeability and symptoms that you're having, your headache, your fatigue, your low energy, your inability to lose weight, that is pure commercialism. That is basically a supplement manufacturer trying to sell you on the idea that their pill is going to fix this. So just as we have zero evidence that any of those pills or supplements are going to fix your leaky gut, we don't have direct evidence with a lot of these symptoms, things, autism, chronic fatigue syndrome, food allergies, autoimmune diseases. We don't have direct evidence that leaky gut is directly responsible for that. Leaky gut is probably, in many of these instances, a sort of additional mechanism or a result of whatever it is. If it's, too many antibiotics and your poor diet and your chronic stress that have conspired to create an autoimmune disease, an increase in intestinal permeability is probably one of the manifestations of those things, not the cause. So what I see happening in the world of sort of alternative medicine is I see very atavistic supplement companies and practitioners telling people, when we talk about the testing next, oh, do this test. Oh, lo and behold, you have an increase in intestinal permeability. We'll talk about the test in more detail coming up. And here is, a shopping bag full of supplements that are going to heal your leaky gut. And healing a leaky gut starts with number 1, 2, and 3, stopping the things that are causing it damage in the first place. So thinking about your stress, stopping the non-steroidals, making sure you're limiting ultra-processed foods, and really sort of paying attention to what you're ingesting. Okay, that is the way that you heal a leaky gut. Not with these supplements. And the other thing that you can do is replace these foods. And if we were to look at, beyond emulsifiers, what are some of the general categories of foods that cause inflammation and sort of disrupt the gut? It would be lots of refined sugar, lots of alcohol, lots of processed carbohydrates, gluten-containing foods, and a lot of people. So with celiac disease, we know from Dr. Alfasano has done a lot of that research. We see with celiac disease specifically, and in some people with gluten intolerance, that there is an increase in intestinal permeability. But we don't know that that is what is responsible for the symptoms. That, just like with celiac disease, you have flattening of the villi and you have an increase in intraepithelial lymphocytes, you also seem to have an increase in intestinal permeability. So that seems to be part of the sort of, manifestations that we see, but we can't then say, oh, you're gluten intolerant and you're bloated, it's because of your leaky gut, here, take this pill. Again, we have to look at what is causing the increase in intestinal permeability in the first place. But again, taking out a lot of these foods, when I say sugar, I just ate a piece of dark chocolate with some nuts. I'm not concerned that damaged my gut. I had a very healthy lunch, and working from home today, and I often want something sweet after my main meal, which I try to have early. So I had, 3 little squares of dark chocolate with some almonds. Totally fine, totally fine. But if you're eating lots of refined sugar all the time, in particular if you're eating, Twinkies or really processed things, if you are having a lot of alcohol, if you are having a lot of processed gluten, a lot of dairy, because it is an ultra-processed food, and the cows are almost all being fed antibiotics, those are problematic foods. So what can you replace them with? You can replace them with plants, with unprocessed plant fiber. So with broccoli and collard greens and beans and all of those great things, and of course fermented foods too, which seem to be very healing for the gut. So those are all, very reasonable swaps to do. And as I said, take out the ultra-processed foods. But this idea that, you get a test. Oh, yes, this is abnormal. Here, take these pills. That is just magical thinking. So let's talk about the testing. And I will tell you that years ago in my practice, I did a lot of testing for leaky gut. And I did it because people wanted a test. I would explain to people, this is why I think you're having problems with your gut. Looking at your diet and your stress and all the antibiotics and the NSAIDs. So, diet, lifestyle, medicine cabinet. But people, typically, they've had an endoscopy or a CAT scan, ultrasound, it's all been normal, and they want to see that something is abnormal. And that's a very normal human instinct, right? I get that. People want that validation. And I was also curious too, because I'm very skeptical about most of these tests. I am very aware of the scientific data behind it, or more accurately, the lack of scientific data. I've worked with a lot of these companies as a consultant. I've looked at their data and I'm like, yeah, no, you don't have sufficient data. But I was doing this leaky intestinal permeability test, and this is a test. And I was also doing it, and I would tell patients, I'd like to say, look, you know, the results of this test are not going to change what I recommend to you, but I'm interested in the results. And it's not a super expensive test, typically under $100. So if you're interested, we can order it. So I literally have looked at thousands of these results in my patients over the years, okay? Again, being very upfront with patients, this is not going to change what I'm saying, but we're being citizen scientists together and we're looking at these results. So the typical intestinal permeability test gives people 2 sugars, 2 carbohydrates to drink. A relatively large one, lactulose, and a smaller one, mannitol. And lactulose is a large sugar, is not broken down in the gut. And so the theory behind these tests is that when you ingest them, the lactulose is supposed to pass through, just ate lunch, is supposed to, still digesting, is supposed to pass through the gut relatively intact, but the mannitol, because it's smaller, can go through those cellular junctions between the cells and get excreted in the urine. And so you collect a urine sample from this, not stool. And the idea is you look at the lactulose mannitol ratio, and then you're able to tell, you know, the degree of intestinal permeability. Well, it turns out this test is faulty for more than one reason. The main reason is that it turns out the difference in size between the lactulose and the mannitol molecules is not sufficient for them to be absorbed through different pathways. So they're probably going through the same pathway. And so not a reliable test, which is why it is not an FDA-approved test for intestinal permeability. Now, there are complicated tests we can use to measure it. One is called endoscopic impedance, where we do an endoscopy, which is obviously an invasive procedure, requires you to either fast or take a bowel prep, take time off, sedation. This is, you know, not something we would just sort of do out of interest. But and this is really done not in clinical settings, but really in research settings at hospitals. So we measure the impedance, meaning the resistance through the membrane. We put the scope up against the gut lining, and there's a particular little catheter thing we can use to measure the impedance. But again, research setting, okay? So that's one way. We can take biopsies, and there are lots of study. When I say we, I haven't done it, but there's research looking at doing this in mice, doing this in humans, where you take a biopsy of the colon, because we are taking a little sample of the gut lining, or at least the mucosal surface of the lining, and then you can, in the lab, do things sort of in vitro rather than in vivo. So the in vivo testing, meaning in the person, would be the impedance during endoscopy. The in vitro testing would be looking at the tissue after you've done a biopsy and doing that. But the in vitro testing is not going to be as accurate as the in vivo. But why don't we do mucosal impedance clinically? Because it's not helpful. Because if your intestinal permeability is higher, it's not like a glucose level. You know, you have really high glucose, we worry about diabetes, we test you for diabetes. It doesn't work that way. Again, there's not this direct correlation between intestinal permeability and these other things that are going on. So it is not a clinically useful test. And none of the testing out there being done by any of these labs, and I'm not going to name names because I'm going to be polite, but none of this testing is clinically validated. None of this is something that we can hang our hat on and say, aha, your, you know, lactulose mannitol ratio is this, therefore this is what's going on, and here's some zinc and glutamine. Not how it works. But again, how it does work is we can think about replacing the habits, the foods that are damaging your gut lining with more healing foods and trying to restore the integrity of the gut. So in my 31 years as a doctor and my 28 years as a gastroenterologist, 29, what I will tell you is that most of what keeps me busy in my practice is things that we are doing that we shouldn't be doing, okay? So it's not that I have, you know, some fantastic probiotic to whip out and give you or some cure. It is getting you to acknowledge and recognize what you are doing that is causing the problem. And this is not blaming anybody. Trust me, like, you know, I've taken my share of NSAIDs. And eaten my share of processed food. So this is not a blame game. This is empowerment. That's what this is about. Because when you know the things that are causing damage to your gut, and you are able to remove them, eliminate them completely, reduce them, you're able to heal, right? So that is like incredible power. And for me, just watching people being marketed to so aggressively and really being lied to and deceived, and like, here's this pill, is really problematic. I had an incident yesterday, and again, I'm not going to name names to be polite, but I had done an interview last summer with the founder of a very popular supplement company. And to be honest with you, the only reason I did the interview was because I had my new book coming out, The Antiviral Gut. Where is it? Isn't it such a nice cover? Penguin did a great job with the cover, Antiviral Gut. I know you're seeing it backwards, but my one requirement was I do not want my picture to be on it. It's too much pressure, because here's the thing. Look at book number 2, The Microbiome Solution. Look at that hairstyle. Do you see that? I had Kimora Lee Simmons, photographer and glam team. Trust me when I tell you that this hairstyle and all of that you're seeing there that looks nothing like me, that took 4 hours. 4 hours of blow drying and flat ironing and fake lashes out here and makeup and contouring, and yeah, way too much pressure. So people would read the book and then come see me, and they're like, okay, well, who are you? We want this doctor. Who are you? So I'm like, yeah, I don't need my picture on the cover. I mean, that wasn't really why, but I think they really did do a lovely job with that. So I digress, to get back to the story. So I get an email from a lovely, lovely person who works with this unnamed supplement company with very aggressive marketing. And they happen to have a very beautiful founder, as a lot of these companies do. So she's, long and lanky with a beautiful head of hair. And they said she would love to interview you. We're trying to do more educational work. We want to interview key opinion leaders. And, we're going to blast your interview from the mountaintop. So we want to, hear from the scientists and clinicians and researchers. So I said, great. Again, I wouldn't have done it if I didn't have the book coming out in November. So I was like, great. Well, when will it be released? Can we mention the book and release it around that time? Sure. I do the interview. Towards the end of the interview, she tries to get me to weigh in on these adaptogens and various things that are in their products. And I was like, yeah, no evidence that any of those ingredients are actually doing anything. Eat food, mostly plants, not too much. Michael Pollan's great advice. And so they don't do anything with the interview for a long time. I don't know why. Maybe because I wasn't sufficiently complimentary to some of the ingredients in their products. I don't know why. But they finally released the interview in January. Fine. I got an email from them a few days ago, I guess last week sometime, saying, oh, we're repurposing parts of your interview and we'd like to use it to promote one of our magnesium products in an ad. Is that okay with you? No, not okay, not okay. So I thought, well, we have some educational stuff going on. We have a course called Getting Regular, a great course, 4-week course to manage constipation and banish bloat. We don't promote or sell any products, just tell you what food to eat, what practices to do, what might be causing your constipation. So I said, well, let me take a look, because maybe we could do a little quid pro quo. And, if you're just re-airing my interview, maybe we could mention the course. But they send it to me and it's a straight up ad. It's an advertisement. Their product, me talking about magnesium and magnesium in the gut, but not their magnesium product. So I said, no, this is not good. And while I'm having this discussion, the wonderful nutritionist, Olivia Brandt, who's been working with me, helping me organize this educational content and load things on the back end and doing a great job with our learning management system, is on their website. And she says, oh, do you know you're on their website? You're on their homepage. I was like, what? So I look and I'm all over the website. I'm on the homepage, I'm on their YouTube, SoundCloud. So they basically took the educational interview with me and are using it for promotional purposes. So I, needless to say, went ballistic. And the reason I went ballistic is because I believe in conflict of interest. If I, as a physician, am using what, little credibility I have to sell you products, I am not able to give you proper advice because I am now commercially motivated to sell you bullshit. Okay? Simple. So I have a very clear policy, and I had another request yesterday from somebody for a product thing, and they said, oh, we just, we'll love to do an interview with you. I was like, you know what? not doing any of these things. And I was very upfront. I said, unfortunately, I had a bad episode recently where somebody used an interview that I was giving for educational purposes and rebranded it for promotional purposes. So I'm just, sorry, not doing any of that. So I feel very strongly about it. There is a lot of snake oil out there. And while a magnesium product, I'll be the first to tell you that I often use magnesium coupled with fiber supplements for people with constipation. The problem is overselling. Yeah, so magnesium can help your constipation, but it's not going to, heal your gut or, clear your mind or do any of these other 15 things that they claim it's going to do. So there's so much overselling, quite frankly, and deception. And I take a lot of pride in not participating in that. So I just wanted to say that, get up on my soapbox. Okay, let's take some questions. Hey, guess who's on the call with us? Dr. Vincente Petri. Hi, Vincent. How are you? Everybody read his fantastic book. Where is it? Gut Smart Protocol. Okay. So I do like to support my fellow physicians. So Vincent is there. Okay, let's take some questions from you guys. Now that I've gotten off my soap, I got all sweaty with that because I got so, I got so excited and passionate about that I started to sweat. Okay, let's see what we have. My GI diagnosed me with leaky gut and dysbiosis with a question mark saying it's new and no test. So again, these are mechanisms of action, but as I just finished explaining, we don't have great tests for these things. And these are things that you can clinically say. I mean, if somebody comes in to see me and they've been eating a crap diet and taking NSAIDs and drinking lots of alcohol and stressed out, I'll say you likely will have a leaky gut. But again, the solution is not just to fix the leaky gut with a pill. The solution is, how about we stop taking the NSAIDs and eating the crappy diet and doing all of those things, right? That's what's going to really heal it. So to say it's new is really to say that we don't know a lot about these conditions yet in terms of really good scientific information. And yeah, the testing is not great because even 5 years ago when I was doing a lot of leaky gut testing, it was based on misinformation that the size of the lactulose and the mannitol were similar. And so they were absorbed via different pathways. And now it turns out that that's probably not the case. So the test is really not valid. Okay, so let's see. Or not, I don't want to say that it's not valid, but it's not a diagnosis. It's a mechanism, okay? So we have to find out if you have increased intestinal permeability, what has caused it? And we have to reverse those things by stopping the things that caused it. And that's really what I'm trying to get at with this whole, fact versus fiction. Okay, so let's see what else we have. Beautiful curves. It's so good to see you. Thank you for joining me. And you always have such good questions. Chronic infection, the body has been trying to fight. Yes, that can be a cause of an increase in intestinal permeability. Yes, we do see that. People who have, for example, parasitic infestation, certain types of E. coli infection, E. coli 0157H7, a subtype of E. coli has been associated with that. So that is absolutely true. I'm sure I'm saying your name incorrectly, Colette Kelly-Josu, but it sounds so nice. Colette Kelly-Josu wants to know, would you say that chronic stress like worries, drugs, environmental agents are all stresses to the body? Absolutely. Absolutely. Huge stressors to the body. Thank you for pointing that out. Michelle wants to know, what do I think about treating SIBO with antibiotics? I think it's a terrible idea. So small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, a condition that is really, when we talk about SIBO, we're really talking about dysbiosis. We're really talking about a disrupted gut microbiome, not just overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine. We do see that because part of the imbalance with SIBO is that as we move from north to south, from, mouth to anus in the gut, the amount of bacteria increases as we go down. So the small intestine should normally have a lot less bacteria than the colon. And so one of the things we see with a disrupted microbiome is, in addition to seeing a decrease in diversity, primarily alpha diversity, a decrease in certain species and a less diverse microbiome, we sometimes see more bacteria in parts of the gut than we normally do. We can see more bacteria in the small intestine. We see mouth anaerobes that are usually in the mouth, now overrepresented in the colon. So it's just all messed up. It's like if you took a jigsaw puzzle that was all laid out and then you just messed it up, okay? But of course, the pharmaceutical companies, and one in particular, unnamed because I'm polite, enlisted with the help of several GI researchers to come up with this idea that, oh, we're going to use an antibiotic to suppress the bacteria in the small intestine, and that's going to fix the problem. And so most people who do take that antibiotic, Xifaxan or rifaximin, will feel better temporarily because now you've sort of decreased levels of bacteria in general. But generally after a few weeks or sometimes a month, as the bacteria start to regrow, people feel even worse. So my office is littered with people who have had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 courses of Xifaxan, and now they're really messed up because, of course, that antibiotic has killed off some of the healthy bacteria too. There's no antibiotic that only kills off the bad stuff. So treating SIBO with antibiotics, terrible idea, because antibiotics are one of the things that cause SIBO. Okay. View on probiotics. Mostly save your money, eat some fermented foods or an apple. There are particular situations, pouchitis, which is inflammation in the remaining segment of the gut that can occur after the colon is taken out, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, necrotizing enterocolitis, a very significant form of inflammation in the gut, mostly in infants, traveler's diarrhea. There's some other specific situations where very specific probiotics, usually at high dose, not always commercially available, can play a role. There's really interesting data from Thailand. This was January this year, December last year. A group was able to decolonize the body with MRSA. So methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, which is a form of staph. They call it methicillin-resistant because it's resistant to the antibiotic methicillin. So MRSA or MRSA, which is really the bugaboo for a lot of hospital infections. Many people are colonized with MRSA. I mean, we have staph all over our bodies. Staph is what? Staphylococcus aureus or Staphylococcus epidermis is one of the commonest bacteria on our skin. But MRSA means it's a more aggressive staph. It's resistant to methicillin. And by the way, how did it get resistant to methicillin? Too many antibiotics. So they were able, this group, using a probiotic. It was called... it's Bacillus something. I apologize. I haven't looked at the paper in a while, but this particular Bacillus subtype of the bacteria, and I, again, apologize, I forget. By giving high doses of that, they were able to crowd out the MRSA in people who are chronically colonized. And the really fascinating thing here is that antibiotics aren't able to decolonize you with MRSA, right? You have methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, you try and give more potent antibiotics, it doesn't work. Probably because you kill off so much of the healthy bacteria that themselves are helping to crowd out the MRSA, right? But they were able to do that with this Bacillus subtype probiotic. But again, this is an experimental setting. You can't, this is not a bacteria you can go to CVS or GNC or Whole Foods and buy off the shelf. So I think we are, you know, this idea of sort of probiotic therapy is in its infancy. We are going to see, you know, lots of research with this. But again, wouldn't it be better if we prevented the MRSA by being more judicious with our antibiotic use, right? That's really the goal, so that we're not, you know, we're not trying to close the barn doors after the horse has already left. Okay. Do most illnesses come from chronic stress? I don't think so. I think there are, you know, illnesses, there are so many different illnesses, and there are lots of different contributing factors. So chronic stress is certainly a contributor to many of our chronic illnesses, and it can, if not cause, it can worsen many diseases. So if you think of something like irritable bowel syndrome, that affects 20-30% of the population in this country. Chronic stress is a contributor, but I think it would be a stretch to say that for most people, chronic stress is the cause of their illness. Okay, what else do we have? Pringles ultra processed. Yeah, beautiful curves. Thank you for pointing that out. How about organic soy? What's recommended for milk in this case, doctor? Yeah, it does depend on the brand. But what I want you to do is I want you to look at a soybean, right? Get some edamame. And then I want you to look at white soy milk. And you tell me how you get from here to there. How do you get from a green soybean plant to this white creamy milk? Some processing involved. There's quite a bit of processing involved. So even apples to applesauce is, you know, it's like when people tell me, oh, look at these lentil chips. I'm like, what part, this bag of lentil chips came out of a factory. This is a factory food. This is not the same as eating lentils. So I'm not, the other thing too is that for some people, a lot of people and a lot of my plant-based friends will swear up and down and they'll, show me evidence about the medicinal benefits of soy, but we're talking primarily about organic fermented soy in its natural state. We're not talking about soy yogurt and soy milk and these ultra-processed forms of soy. So not a huge fan of it. It's very bloating for most people. There are a lot of people who come to see me for bloating, and just getting rid of the, soy milk latte for a lot of them is very helpful. And for some people, the soy can be a form of xenoestrogen, of additional estrogen outside the body that can be problematic depending on what the condition is. But I never like to say like, don't, huge categories of food to just avoid, unless we're talking about obvious things that are not even food, like artificial sweeteners or soda or just straight up chemicals, right? Because there may be a compelling reason why a soy milk or organic fermented soy in its unprocessed form is good and can have health benefits. So I misread your question. So I guess you are talking about milk. You said, how about organic soy? What's recommended for milk in this case, doctor? So important to point out that even an organic soy milk is an ultra-processed food versus some organic fermented soy that you may eat in a natural state. Okay. I am having issues with severe gas throughout my abdomen. I'm in pain, can last 2 hours and subsides. I usually take an enzyme, use a heating pad, and have a bowel movement. Well, I hope that those things help, particularly the heating pad and bowel movement. But, without knowing you, it's really hard to give you advice. And again, I just want to remind everybody that the point of this office hours is not to give you medical advice, but for me to educate you a little bit on some of these gut health topics. So depending on what else is going on, there's so many things that could be causing abdominal pain. But one of the things that I encounter regularly is that people are plugged. So if you have a bowel movement that's not coming out, you will get a lot of dilation of the GI tract above that as you eat food and as your GI tract secretes fluids and gas, etc., which, gas is a natural part of the digestive process. So if that's happening and you haven't evacuated, you're going to be uncomfortable. So it sounds like when you have a bowel movement, things get better. So you probably need to work on your constipation, and you'd be a great candidate for our Getting Regular course, which you can find at gutbliss.com under courses. Okay. Shameless plug there. My son keeps getting recurring strep throat. He's on antibiotics every other week, sadly. Yeah, this is my daughter's story and how she ended up so sick. His 4th time this year, ENT specialist pending appointment. Do you recommend anything for his gut during this time? I recommend that you find out why he keeps getting recurring strep throat. In my daughter's case, it was because all the antibiotics were making her more susceptible, and tubes in her ears also helped with the pharyngitis. But also talk to your son's pediatrician about whether they need to treat with antibiotics every time, because we treat strep with antibiotics to prevent 2 serious but rare complications: post-strep glomerulonephritis, which is a kind of kidney disease, and rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease, which affects the heart. But those are very rare complications. I mean, we see those, 1 in a million. Strep on its own will resolve. It will be a longer course, sometimes more complicated, but you should have this discussion with the pediatrician. It doesn't necessarily need to be a knee-jerk response every time they have strep, oh, they must have an antibiotic. So I want you to have a more detailed discussion, and it's good that you're seeing the ENT. Be wary if they recommend just taking out the tonsils, because the tonsils are actually an important part of our immune system. And so we generally don't, those of us who are more sort of immune-minded, don't recommend just, yanking out the tonsils without a lot of consideration. But that's good you're seeing the ENT doc and trying to figure out why that's happening. And I wish him the best of luck. It truly was my daughter's story and how she ended up so sick. Okay. Brian says, I'm very confused about gluten. I don't have celiac and no evidence of gluten sensitivity. Should I cut it out? Okay, Brian, that's such a great question, and I really appreciate your candor. So here's the thing. Most wheat products are highly processed foods, okay? When we're seeing wheat in, whether it's, in a ultra-processed food like this granola bar or something else that you're buying off the shelf from the supermarket. And Al Fasano, again, who's a pediatric gastroenterologist, Italian originally, has done a lot of this research. And what he has found in his lab is that gluten, which again is a protein in wheat, rye, and barley, in most people will increase intestinal permeability. Now, that doesn't mean it's causing symptoms, right? And that doesn't mean that that increase in intestinal permeability is necessarily a terrible thing. I mean, we don't think it's a great thing. So if you have celiac disease, obviously you have to avoid gluten 100%. If you have gluten sensitivity, which means you have symptoms when you eat gluten, you should avoid it. But you may not know if you're gluten sensitive. So what I usually recommend, because in my practice, what I find is that people who are constipated, people who have inflammatory bowel disease, people who have diverticulosis, people who are bloated, so many people with gut issues, when they decrease the gluten, they don't have to eliminate it completely. If you have celiac disease, you have to eliminate it completely. But when they tell me, oh yeah, I have celiac, it's not a problem for me, I have them eliminate it. And when I say eliminate, sort of get rid of 80 to 90% of it for 6 weeks. The vast majority feel better. They notice a difference, particularly with diverticulosis. They'll say they're not as bloated, they're not as uncomfortable. So I don't think that you have to, look at gluten as the devil, but recognize that it is a marker for processed foods, right? Most of the gluten-containing foods you're eating, I mean, if you're getting a nice fresh baked sourdough bread, for example, from a bakery, that would be a reasonable form to eat gluten in, but gluten is used as filler, like soy, in a lot of foods. So if you are thinking about it, I would just say, cut down a lot on the gluten for a month, 6 weeks, see how you feel. If your gut gives you the feedback that it likes to not have gluten, then that's what you should do. Okay, good luck with that. Okay, what else do we have? Somebody said they went through all the main GI tests and found nothing. What else do we have? I'm gonna actually dash in just a minute because I have something at 4 that I have to dash off for. But somebody, Tough Bro says, thanks for sharing. Get to know the inside stories of what is happening out there. Change your mind. And Fleur says, love how healthy your hair is. And thank you for the lives. Thank you for that. I just find that the less I do to my hair, the healthier it is. So I try to wash it and just sort of leave it alone and not use a bunch of chemicals in it. And it seems to be sticking around. So thank you for that. I do dye it though. And that is the thing because of gray. And we know that hair dye is terrible for you, but I try not to do it a lot, a couple times a year. So Miller, KJ555, another one of our regulars. Hi there. You said there's no evidence that glutamine heals a gut, but is there evidence that it doesn't? My daughter took it for 2 months and was unable to eat food she was sensitive to. So that's an interesting observation. And what I would ask you is, well, what else did she do during those 2 months? If all she did was take the gluten and she made if all she did was take the glutamine and she made no other changes, then I would say, okay, well, maybe, who knows, placebo effect, 30%. But I suspect if she was recommended I suspect that if she was recommended to take glutamine by somebody, they probably also recommended some other things, like maybe some dietary changes, etc. Or maybe in the 2 months that she was taking the glutamine, it was also 2 months off the NSAIDs or whatever had caused the damage, and so she felt better. So again, that is an N=1 experiment. So that is, not sort of clinically significant information, but I get what you're saying. You're saying is, does it hurt? And the answer to that is we don't know for a lot of these tests, for a lot of these substances, because they are not tested for safety or efficacy. And that's why they all have that little label at the bottom, right? That says this drug does not treat, cure any condition. So, certainly as supplements go, and I'm pretty familiar with the literature for most of these supplements, glutamine is not a dangerous supplement. So, bottom line, I'm glad your daughter feels better. Hopefully she did some other things and maybe that's what caused the improvement, but it's okay. I'm glad to hear it. Thank you for that. Somebody says, I've been taking action, all from education from your books and lives. Thank you. Oh, you're so welcome. You're so welcome. Okay. Beak Isla wants to know solutions for SIBO. We're going to do that real soon. We're going to do that in May because there's just so many questions about that. Can UC be put in remission with diet? Yes, Candy 1108. Yes. And let me just spend the last 2 minutes talking about that. I did my gastroenterology fellowship at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. I did med school residency, was chief resident for a year at Columbia. But I did my GI fellowship at Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai is a really important hospital in the world of inflammatory bowel disease because Dr. Burl B. Crone as well as doctors Oppenheimer and Ginsburg, described Crohn's disease there. He got the name in 1932. And so Mount Sinai was back then and still is a real GI care hospital. They have a GI care center, multiple floors of just GI patients. And they had a really long and wonderful tradition of caring for patients with inflammatory bowel disease. I was trained by Dr. Janowitz, Dr. Henry Janowitz. I have his picture somewhere here. Might be in my office, but Dr. Janowitz was already in his 80s when I was a GI fellow, and we were in Dr. Crohn's old office. We sat at Dr. Crohn's desk because Dr. Crohn begat Dr. Janowitz, who begat Dr. Sacker, who was my chairman, who begat me. So the long history of IBD care there. And if you had told me back in, 95 when I was doing my GI fellowship that I would be putting people with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis into remission using diet, I literally would have laughed at in your face. I would have been like, haha, that is pure fantasy. But it turns out we have a 79% remission rate. Now, the most potent biologic out there only has about a 46% remission rate. And guess what? It can cause cancer and serious infection. And my diet plan certainly cannot cause cancer and serious infection. It can only make you healthier. So we launched a course last year called Drug-Free IBD, Remission Without Immunosuppression. We beta tested it with about 24 people, was great. And we're relaunching it in the beginning of June. And I'm very proud of it. We're relaunching it not live, just because it's hard for me to do the live courses because it's a 2-hour Zoom every week. And it's just hard to have that time available. So what I'm doing is I'm taking, all the questions people asked, all the frequently asked questions, and we're doing a lot of audio and video in addition to the modules. It's a lot of information. Our current workbook for this course is 200 pages. So we're trying to condense it a little bit without leaving out any of the good parts. And the goal is that this is really a resource for you to help put your ulcerative colitis into remission with diet. And when I say drug-free, I don't mean no drugs necessarily, but there's a clear line in the sand. We have drugs like the 5-aminosalicylic acid drugs like Azokal and Lialda, all the versions of mesalamine. And then above the line, we have things like steroids and biologics, and these drugs suppress your immune system. And so when you suppress your immune system, what do you get? Potential increased risk of cancer and infection. So what we're really trying to do is teach people how to put their disease into remission without these drugs. And the two things that seem to be really important are maintaining the permeability of the intestine and maintaining the health of the microbiome. And so this course is as much about what you shouldn't do as what you should, right? So the emulsifiers, the NSAIDs, all of those things, as well as what are all the really important nourishing foods you need to be eating, as well as things like sleep and stress. It's not a coincidence that so many of the IBD patients I see who are college students have flare-ups during exams, right? So please do join us, Candy 1108. If you, I don't think you can register for the course yet. I don't think registration is open, but it will be in about another week. So if you go to gutless.com courses, give us about a week to get that registration page open, and hope to see you for that course. Okay, so you know what? It is a minute away. Oh, wait. Oh, Colette Kelly-Josue is a neuropsychiatrist from the Caribbean. Oh, how nice. Hello, my brother. So as most of you know, I'm Jamaican, a very proud Jamaican. You're so welcome. I'm so glad to take your questions. And I'm so glad to know you're using this knowledge to help your patients. That is wonderful. Neuropsychiatrist, so interesting. The whole field of psychobiotics is so fascinating, of how probiotics may help treat these neurological conditions. But again, we wouldn't need the probiotics if we were taking care of our gut microbes in the first place, right? So let's not try and close the barn door after the horse has gone out. Let's really protect our microbes. It's very simple, folks. Limit the medications that are harming your gut microbes and your gut lining. Eat real, healthy, nourishing foods, mostly plants. Try and reduce your stress as best you can, or figure out a good response to it. Meditate, exercise, get out in nature, get dirty, get exposure to soil microbes. Dirt, sweat, veg. That's it. Bye, everyone. See you next week.